There's a lot covered in the news about President Trump's mass deportation plans and how it's going to be implemented domestically. But there's a second part of this, and that's the repatriation process. Believe it or not a lot of countries want to accept their people back. That's for political reasons as well as huge economic reasons. Most people don't realize that the remittance money made from illegal immigrants in the U.S. accounts for huge portions of these countries' economies. So we're going to take a real high-level overview of specifically Latin American countries with the highest number of illegal immigrants in the U.S. I should say at the start, I've backpacked through these countries. I love the people. They're beautiful places. But what we're going to look at is the system itself and the leaders in Latin America and their approach to working with Donald Trump. They're surprising allies and a few adversaries, including one that looks like she could be the twin sister of Consuela from Family Guy. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to start with talking about Mexico. Mexico, no surprise, given its geographical proximity to the U.S., has the largest number of illegal immigrants here in the U.S. Let's go through the numbers. According to Pew Research, there's approximately 4.8 Mexicans living in America illegally right now. That accounts for about 37% of all undocumented immigrants in the U.S. So huge percentage of them. Now talking about that remittance money, remittance money going to Mexico, mostly from the United States, adds up to $63 billion a year. Not a small chunk of change. So the new president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, has agreed to actually, informally, potentially work with the Trump administration, not just for repatriating Mexicans, but also possibly assisting with other nationals where their governments are not so willing to negotiate with the U.S., primarily Venezuela and even a small portion of Cuban immigrants. So she went on. Right now, the administrations are just in talks within one another. Remember, she's the new president of Mexico. He's an incoming president of the U.S., but they have reported to collaborate through different mechanisms, quote. So we're going to say that as of right now, that looks like it's in a good trajectory. More to follow there. I should note that a lot of Americans don't know she actually went to school in the U.S. and lived in the U.S., but I believe for over a decade. So she does speak English. She is different from several of her predecessors. Going further south, now let's go with Guatemala. Guatemala's president is Bernardo Arevillo. You can correct me in the comments if I misspelled that or mispronounced that. Now, Guatemala has 675,000 known illegal immigrants in the U.S. These numbers, by the way, are mostly from the Pew Research Center or from the U.S. government. They're not by any means a fixed number. We all know with the illegal immigration system, there are a lot of people in the U.S. that are not documented or accounted for. So assume these are very conservative estimates. Now, Guatemala receives $20 billion in remittance money from the United States. So it should be noted that that is a huge part of their GDP. In fact, it accounts for approximately 19% or 1/5 of the country's entire income comes from money made in the U.S. So needless to say, Guatemala might not be too excited on the face of it to start accepting these remittance flights back to the repatriation flights back to the U.S. However, so far, it seems they are. They're the only Latin American country that I'm aware of that actually proactively reached out to the incoming Trump administration. And although they already accept 14 repatriation flights a week, they're already in talks to extend that. And similar to Mexico, they are open to accommodating other nationalities. This is important for reasons I'm going to get into in a minute, because believe it or not all of these countries' leaders want their people back. So far, Guatemala seems like it's on the up and up working with the Trump administration. Now, let's move down the list. And let's go to Honduras. Now, Honduras' president Ms. Castro, not so willing to work with the Trump administration. Should be noted that Honduras has, there's about 525,000 known Honduran nationals living in the United States illegally. For their part, Remittance equates to about $19.2 billion annually. That's approximately 23% of their entire GDP, so even more than Guatemala's. And they are being a lot less cooperative, possibly for a few reasons. There was a USAID study in 2019 that found that 48% of 18 to 29-year-olds in Honduras plan to try to make it to the United States, mostly illegally. So for whatever reason, there's a different culture down there in Honduras for this. Now, getting to the point with Mrs. Castro's willingness or unwillingness to work with the Trump administration, she had a very high-profile New Year's broadcast on national television there, where she threatened to kick U.S. troops out of the country if President Trump proceeds with his plans. Now, it should be noted, there are approximately about 1,000 U.S. troops in Honduras. We've been there since the early 80s, working in cooperation with the Honduran military. We don't formally have a base there, but we have a very strong presence, and we have for, as I mentioned, multiple decades. The interesting thing about that is we help the Honduran military with drug interdiction and humanitarian assistance in the area. So doesn't seem like that would be in the Hondurans' best interest either. But for anyway, that's what she's threatening. So far, Honduras not willing to work with the Trump administration. Moving on down, we've got El Salvador with the very high-profile president Armando Bukele. Bukele is known. He's been in the media in the U.S. even several times for his very high-profile stance against crushing MS-13. He took a very high-profile stance, and he does have a high-profile relationship with the Trump administration. Now, should be noted, there's 750,000 known El Salvadorian nationals living in the U.S. illegally. For their part, they count for $8.2 billion in remittance going back to El Salvador, and that's about 23% of their GDP. Now, there has been no formal agreement. Nothing's been reported on talks with the Trump administration. But given the past warm relations with the Trump family, not just Trump himself, we're going to go ahead and say that Bukele probably will work a deal with the Trump administration to figure something out. So far, we'll say El Salvador is going to work with them. Moving on down to Nicaragua. Now, Nicaragua is led by kind of a despot. His name is Daniel Ortega. He's an extreme leftist. He is seen as somewhat pro-business, but still very much an extreme leftist. He's known for cracking down very oppressively on the Catholic Church in the country. Now, Nicaragua, for their part, we have about 400,000 Nicaraguan nationals living in the U.S. illegally. $4.2 billion in remittance money goes back to Nicaragua every year. Equates to approximately 30% of their GDP, much smaller economy there in Nicaragua. Now, it's the only country on this list I'm going through with U.S. sanctions on it, excluding Venezuela, but we're going to touch on that in just a second. The U.S. sanctions were placed for repressive actions and for human smuggling. Ortega, not such a great guy. So nothing's been reported on their willingness to work with the U.S. or the Trump administration. So we're going to say Ortega, not going to be very helpful in these repatriation efforts. And lastly, as I just mentioned, Venezuela, very high-profile Latin American country, led, of course, by President Nicolas Maduro, who's just got through a very, very contested election, one where the United States actually recognizes the opposition leader as the president of the country. I'm sure that's going to complicate efforts here. Now, they receive about $4.2 billion in remittance, and there's, as of today, there's approximately 470,000 Venezuelans known to be living in the U.S. I won't say illegally, because what's interesting about the Venezuelan case is they're actually, given the political turmoil in Venezuela, they're eligible for TPS, or temporary protective status. That's a different than other countries we mentioned, because they don't have quite the level of unrest that's been going on in Venezuela. Now, all of that being said, and the pretty tumultuous relationship that the Trump administration had with Maduro in the past, Maduro has made kind of ways to extend an olive branch, if you will. He had a very high-profile speech recently where, although he once called Trump a racist cowboy years ago, he has said quote, there's an opportunity for a new start here, and he's calling for a new era of, quote, win-win relations. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But the last thing to mention with Venezuela is there's potentially billions of dollars in oil at stake, because Venezuela is sitting on a huge sum of oil that they've done a really poor job at profiting from, both because of sanctions and their own mismanagement going back to the Chavez regime. So that's a high-level overview of what's going on here, guys. We're going to see a lot of this more in the coming months. I think specifically you're going to probably see a lot more being said about the president of Honduras if she digs in for that, because that's if you're messing with U.S. Troops stationed overseas, I think that's going to get a lot of press. So we'll have to stick around and see how that plays out.